I never expected a single week to change everything I thought I knew about myself. It started on a Monday morning, the kind of morning that felt normal in every sense: grey skies, a lukewarm coffee, my usual route to work. But that day, I noticed a difference in the way people looked at me. At first, it was subtle, a clerk at the cafe hesitating for a moment before addressing me, then saying "Miss" with a polite smile. I froze, not because I minded, but because I wasn't sure why it made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. I corrected her. Of course I had to. I laughed awkwardly and said, "Actually, it's Mr." But her face had this flicker of disappointment, almost like I had let her down, and it unsettled me more than I expected. By the end of that day, it happened again. A stranger on the street, a delivery person at my apartment building, even my boss during a video call, all of them used the same word, "Miss," each time. My initial reaction was to correct them, to assert the identity I had lived with for years, the one that had felt safe, known, predictable. But that day, for reasons I couldn't fully understand, I didn't. I just let it pass. And every time I didn't correct them, a strange warmth spread through me, a quiet, almost thrilling sense of relief and curiosity that made me wonder who I might be if I let go of the identity I had always clung to. It wasn't immediate. The first evening, I tried to dismiss it as coincidence, as a quirk of the way people perceived me with my slightly longer hair and softer features. But the feeling lingered, that quiet, persistent tug at the edges of who I thought I was. I began noticing things about myself that I had ignored for years. The way I enjoyed shopping for clothes but always convinced myself it was just practical, how I lingered a little too long in front of mirrors, adjusting collars or smoothing my hair. The small satisfaction I got from imagining how I might look in something completely different. I pushed the thoughts away, labeling them as strange, fleeting fantasies. Yet, the next morning, when the barista smiled at me and said, "Good morning, miss," I didn't correct her. I didn't even think about it. I just smiled back, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't expected: freedom. By the middle of the week, I noticed a shift in how I moved through the world. I was conscious of my posture, the tilt of my head, the subtle gestures I made with my hands. I experimented with clothing in secret, trying on scarves and sweaters, soft fabrics that I had always considered too feminine for myself. Alone in my apartment, I felt light, untethered, as if I were trying on not just clothes but a new version of myself. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and undeniably real. For the first time, I started to imagine what it would be like if the world truly saw me this way. And with each passing day, I became bolder. Small adjustments, like rolling up sleeves differently or choosing colors that felt more like me, gave me a thrill I couldn't ignore. Thursday came, and with it, an unexpected challenge. My best friend, someone who had known me for over a decade, stopped by unannounced. I wasn't ready to show her the small changes I had made: the longer hair, the different clothing choices, but she noticed anyway. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, I feared judgment. But then she smiled, warm and understanding, and said, "You look happy." That simple acknowledgement felt like permission, like a key turning in a lock that I hadn't realized I was holding. I felt my chest swell with a mix of fear and exhilaration, the kind of sensation that comes when you know you are standing on the edge of something irreversible. I laughed nervously, avoided the deeper explanation, and promised myself that I would think carefully about what I wanted next. By Friday, the world around me had already started to adjust, or maybe it was me adjusting to it. At work, colleagues who had always known me as one identity began to hesitate, then adapt, when they spoke to me. Emails that once began with Mr. now arrived with Miss, and I found myself smiling quietly at each one. It wasn't arrogance or a desire for attention, it was recognition of a truth I had long suppressed, a subtle affirmation that maybe I was allowed to exist differently than I had before. The sensation was intoxicating, like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. And yet, it was accompanied by a shadow of fear: fear of judgment, fear of ridicule, fear of what it might mean for relationships that had always been defined by a different perception of me. That night, alone in my apartment, I made a decision. I looked in the mirror, tracing the outline of my face, the curve of my jaw, the softness of my features that had always felt like liabilities but now seemed like invitations. I allowed myself to imagine stepping out into the world fully, without hesitation, without apology. I pictured walking through the streets, through work, through cafes, fully recognized as who I felt I was inside, and not just the version of me the world had always assumed. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight and thrill of possibility. I understood, in that quiet moment, that I had been carrying a secret, not something shameful, but something powerful, a version of myself waiting to emerge. And for the first time, I felt courage. Saturday arrived, bringing with it a test I hadn't anticipated. My parents came to visit unexpectedly. They had always been traditional, slow to adapt to change, and I felt my heart race at the thought of them seeing the subtle changes I had made: my clothes, my hair, the way I carried myself. But when they entered, something extraordinary happened. My mother's eyes lingered on me a moment longer than usual, and instead of the confusion I had feared, there was recognition, acceptance, even pride. My father, usually quick with a joke or reprimand, simply nodded and smiled, as if he too understood something unspoken. And in that moment, the walls I had built around myself, the ones fortified by years of self-doubt and fear of judgment, began to crumble. I realized that identity isn't defined solely by words or appearances. It is a force, subtle yet undeniable, that grows when acknowledged, even quietly. By the end of the weekend, the world had shifted in small, remarkable ways. Strangers continued to address me as Miss, colleagues adapted without question, friends noticed and celebrated, and my family accepted without hesitation. I had stepped into a new identity without fanfare, without confrontation, and the result was more liberating than I had imagined possible. I understood, finally, that the power of transformation is not in the dramatic gestures or public declarations. It is in the quiet decisions, the small affirmations, the courage to allow yourself to be seen as you truly are. Looking back now, I realize that the week that changed my life began with a simple word and my decision not to correct it. That tiny, almost accidental moment unlocked a door I hadn't known existed. I discovered courage I didn't realize I possessed, the freedom to explore parts of myself I had long suppressed, and the profound relief that comes from being recognized, truly recognized, without pretense. I also discovered that the world is often more flexible, more accepting, and more ready to embrace the truth of someone's identity than we dare to hope. And while fear and uncertainty will always linger on the edges, I learned that the quiet acts of honesty, self-acceptance, and courage can shift the course of a life in ways that nothing else can. Now, months later, I move through the world fully acknowledged, fully myself, and with a sense of calm I had never known. People still say Miss when they see me, and I smile quietly, no longer questioning, no longer correcting, because I have learned that the title matters far less than the truth it represents. I have become someone who can embrace every fragment of her identity without apology, someone who has learned that courage is quiet, that transformation often comes gently, and that the world, if you let it, can see you for exactly who you are, even when it surprises you. And in that truth, I have found a freedom so profound it feels like stepping into sunlight for the very first time, a warmth that never fades, a reassurance that the person I am inside finally has a name, a place, and a life that belongs fully to her. The weeks that followed were nothing short of surreal. Each morning, I woke with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. It was as if my world had shifted overnight, yet everything around me remained the same. People continued to call me Miss, and I continued to let it pass without correction. But now it wasn't just a small thrill, it was a test, a challenge that demanded honesty with myself. I found myself thinking about every interaction, every glance, every subtle shift in tone, wondering if people could sense the quiet transformation I was undergoing, and if they would react the way I secretly hoped. At work, the change became more pronounced. My colleagues, who had once treated me with the casual detachment of routine, began to adjust unconsciously to the new version of me. Meetings that had been purely functional now carried a strange undertone of curiosity. I noticed small gestures, a door held open a second longer than usual, a compliment offered softly but sincerely, a fleeting smile that lingered just long enough to unsettle me in the best possible way. I realized I was learning not just to exist in this new identity, but to move through the world with it, to inhabit it fully and convincingly. And with that realization came a power I hadn't anticipated, not a power over others, but a power over myself, a sense that I could define who I was, moment by moment, choice by choice. It wasn't always easy. Some mornings, I caught myself hesitating, wondering if I had gone too far, if I was being reckless or naive. I imagined the judgment of strangers, the whispers behind closed doors, the casual assumptions that might undermine everything I was building. But each time, I reminded myself that this was my life, my identity, and my right to explore it safely. The tension between fear and exhilaration became almost intoxicating. I discovered that transformation is rarely linear. It comes in bursts, in moments of doubt and moments of revelation, and the key is to keep moving forward, even when the path is unclear. One afternoon, I encountered a moment that tested me in ways I had never expected. A client, someone I had known for years, approached me in the lobby of our office building. He looked me up and down, paused, and then said, with unmistakable politeness, "Miss, could you review these documents?" My heart raced. This was someone who had known me in a completely different light, who had addressed me as Mr. countless times before. And yet here he was, treating me without hesitation, without judgment, without question. I felt a rush of validation and fear intertwined, a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it. I nodded, smiled, and took the documents, my pulse pounding with the thrill of authenticity. That night, I reflected on how far I had come. Alone in my apartment, I stood in front of the mirror, tracing my own features, feeling the texture of my hair, the lines of my face, the subtle curves and angles that had always felt familiar yet strange. I realized that this transformation wasn't just external. It had begun in the quiet corners of my mind, in the small, almost imperceptible decisions to accept and nurture the person I had always been inside. And now it had spilled outward, into the world, into my interactions, into the very way people saw me. I felt both vulnerable and invincible, as if I had finally stepped into a version of myself that had been waiting all along. By the following week, I began experimenting more boldly. I allowed myself to explore fashion, colors, and styles I had previously considered off-limits. Soft fabrics, delicate patterns, flowing lines, each choice felt like a brushstroke on a canvas I was finally free to paint. I noticed how my posture changed, how my gestures became more fluid, more deliberate, more aligned with the identity I had chosen to inhabit. Each time I passed a mirror, I no longer flinched or hesitated. I studied myself carefully, like someone learning a language they had always wanted to speak. And slowly, I began to feel an unfamiliar but profound sense of harmony, a connection between my inner self and my outward appearance that I had never experienced before. The most surprising revelation came when I ventured out into public spaces without any attempt at concealment. Walking down the street, I noticed the way people's eyes lingered just a little longer, the subtle nods of acknowledgement, the quiet respect embedded in casual gestures. I realized that society, often thought rigid and unforgiving, could be surprisingly accommodating when met with quiet confidence and authenticity. The world did not demand that I shrink or disguise myself, it merely responded to the energy I projected, the courage I carried in every step, in every movement, in every word. Then came the moment that truly cemented the transformation. I was invited to a formal gathering, an event I had always attended in conventional attire, blending into the background without comment. This time, I chose carefully, a soft, elegant outfit that spoke to who I had become, paired with subtle details that expressed my personality. I entered the room, and for the first time, I noticed the ripple of recognition, curiosity, and subtle admiration. People addressed me as Miss without hesitation, without correction, and I realized that I no longer cared whether they understood the full story. What mattered was that I had fully embraced myself, unapologetically, and that acceptance began with me. That night, as I left the event and walked through quiet streets, I felt a sense of peace I had never known. The fear, the uncertainty, the tension, they were still there in small measures, shadows at the edges of consciousness, but they no longer controlled me. I had discovered that the act of being true to oneself is both radical and ordinary, both terrifying and liberating, both delicate and unstoppable. I had learned that transformation is not a single moment but a series of choices, quiet and deliberate, that accumulate into a new reality. And as I breathed in the night air, feeling the subtle rhythm of the world around me, I understood with a clarity that startled me. I was no longer hiding, no longer apologizing, no longer correcting anyone. I was simply being. Months later, the word Miss has become a quiet anthem of my journey. It is no longer just a title, It is a marker of courage, of authenticity, of the delicate and powerful act of living fully as oneself. I move through the world differently now, with an awareness of every gaze, every gesture, every interaction, but without fear or hesitation. I have learned that identity is not fixed, that it is fluid, and that courage is the willingness to explore it honestly, without apology. The people around me have adapted, some with ease, some with curiosity, and others with quiet wonder. But I have adapted too, learning that the most profound acceptance begins within. And so I continue, living each day with subtle, deliberate confidence, embracing every nuance of who I am, and allowing the world to respond as it will. I have discovered the quiet power of a simple decision, to stop correcting others, to stop apologizing, to simply be. I have learned that transformation is not about shocking the world, but about quietly claiming the space you deserve, the life you have the courage to inhabit, and the identity you have always known in the deepest corners of your heart. And in that knowledge, I have found something extraordinary, a life that is wholly, undeniably mine, a freedom that no one can take away, and a joy that is constant, gentle, and irrevocable. Over the following months, life took on a strange, almost dreamlike quality. Every interaction, every glance, every word spoken by others felt loaded with new meaning. Strangers who once barely noticed me now smiled warmly, addressing me as Miss without hesitation. Even the tone of my voice had begun to shift, softened, deliberate, aware. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it in my bones. Each morning, as I dressed and looked in the mirror, I saw a version of myself I had never truly allowed to exist, confident, poised, authentic. And with that reflection came a quiet, thrilling fear, because it made me wonder how far I could push this new self without losing the people and life I had built. One day, walking through the park, a child tugged at her mother's hand and said, "Look, Mommy, she's pretty." The mother glanced at me, then smiled politely, and the child's word lingered in the air. Pretty. Miss. Not Mr. Not the familiar version I had carried for years. My stomach tightened, a mixture of elation and fear twisting together. I realized that transformation isn't just about how you see yourself, it's about how the world reflects that change back to you. And in that reflection, I found something I had longed for but never acknowledged, the joy of recognition, the thrill of being seen fully, without pretense. Work became a minefield of small, quiet victories. Each email addressed to me as Miss was a subtle affirmation. Each coworker's deliberate politeness felt like an acknowledgement of my identity, even when unspoken. And yet, it wasn't all seamless. There were moments of doubt, whispers of anxiety that crept in late at night. What if someone I trusted didn't accept this version of me? What if my family, my friends, my colleagues began to see me as a stranger, rather than the person they had known for years? The tension was almost unbearable at times, the suspense of living a dual reality, the self I had always known and the self I was allowing the world to recognize pulling me in two directions. Then came a day that would change everything. I was asked to give a presentation at work, something I had done countless times before. Only this time, I chose to dress fully in the style that reflected my new identity, letting the fabrics, colors, and lines speak for me before I even began to speak. I walked into the room, heart pounding, and noticed the subtle pause in the room, the faint flicker of curiosity, perhaps even admiration, on faces that had known me for years. As I spoke, something remarkable happened. I felt fully aligned with myself. My voice carried a strength I had never known, a fluidity and presence that drew attention without effort. The room responded. Colleagues nodded, smiled, and engaged with me not as the version of me they had assumed but as the person I truly was. And in that moment, I understood something profound. Transformation isn't just a personal journey, it changes the way the world interacts with you, often in ways you cannot predict. At home, the dynamic shifted in quiet, subtle ways. My parents, who had always been loving but cautious, began to adapt naturally. My mother lingered a little longer in conversation, asking questions about my choices, my interests, my plans, without judgment. My father, usually reserved, offered small compliments and adjustments to our routines that subtly acknowledged my identity. These acts, though quiet, were more powerful than any declaration or confrontation. I realized that acceptance is often a slow process, built through countless small gestures rather than dramatic pronouncements. Even friendships evolved. Some friends adapted immediately, their curiosity mingled with genuine care. Others hesitated, struggled, then gradually came around, drawn by the authenticity they could see in me. I found that honesty, courage, and consistency were more persuasive than argument or explanation. I no longer had to justify my existence, I simply had to inhabit it fully, and the world adjusted around me. And with that understanding came an unexpected sense of peace. I could move through life without fear of discovery, without hesitation, without apology. I could simply be. There were still moments of suspense, though moments that tested my resolve. A colleague who had always been strict with formalities misgendered me once during a meeting, and my pulse quickened. But instead of correcting them, I paused, breathed, and smiled softly. Their discomfort was palpable, but so was my calm. I realized then that patience, quiet confidence, and self-assurance were as important as any outward sign of transformation. The world will often resist change, but it responds to courage with its own subtle acknowledgement. Months turned into a year, and the world had adapted in ways I could scarcely have imagined. Strangers addressed me correctly, friends and family had grown accustomed to the person I had become, and I had learned to inhabit this identity with ease and grace. I discovered joy in small things, choosing an outfit that made me feel radiant, walking down the street fully visible, receiving polite compliments without flinching, watching the quiet curiosity of the world as it adjusted to the reality I had always known. And through it all, the most important transformation occurred quietly, internally. I no longer saw myself as a collection of traits I needed to defend or hide. I no longer feared judgment or rejection. I had discovered that the courage to embrace your true self is its own reward, a liberation that radiates through every interaction, every glance, every word spoken. I had learned that identity is fluid, that acceptance begins within, and that the world will often meet you where you stand, if only you are brave enough to stand fully. Now, when someone says miss, I smile softly, letting the word settle into the space I have claimed for myself. I don't correct, I don't explain, I don't hesitate. That word, once a source of tension, now symbolizes freedom, courage, and the quiet triumph of living authentically. I have learned that transformation is not a single act but a lifetime of small choices, each one building upon the last, each one shaping the world and shaping me. And in that realization, I have found a peace and joy I never imagined possible, a life that is fully mine, fully visible, and fully embraced. As the months passed, the transformation became more than just how I looked or how others perceived me. It became a part of who I was at the very core. I began noticing the smallest details, the tilt of my chin, the curve of my shoulders, the subtle cadence of my voice. Each of these things, once unnoticed or even suppressed, now felt deliberate and expressive, tools I could use to align the outer world with my inner self. There were moments when I caught my reflection in a store window or passing glass and felt a jolt of recognition, as if I were seeing someone I had longed to meet for years, finally standing fully in the world. One morning, a minor incident brought both fear and exhilaration. I was at the local market, reaching for a loaf of bread, when the cashier, a woman I had seen countless times, looked at me and said, "Miss, did you find everything you needed?" My heart skipped. For an instant, I felt that old pull, the urge to correct her, to assert the identity I had carried for so long. But instead, I smiled softly, nodded, and said thank you. Walking out of the store, carrying my groceries, I realized how far I had come. The small act of not correcting her had become a deliberate, powerful choice, a testament to my courage and authenticity. That moment, insignificant to anyone else, felt monumental to me. Even in social settings, I began to notice the difference. Invitations that had once been perfunctory now carried an undercurrent of curiosity and respect. Friends and acquaintances treated me differently, not because they were obliged to, but because they sensed the change I had embraced. I found myself navigating conversations with a newfound grace, aware of the subtle ways my identity influenced interactions, yet comfortable enough to let the world respond naturally. The suspense of uncertainty remained sometimes sharp, sometimes dull, but it no longer dominated my experience. I was learning that living authentically means balancing the thrill of discovery with the calm of acceptance. At home, The subtle transformations deepened my relationships in unexpected ways. My parents, once cautious and hesitant, now interacted with me with quiet ease. My mother asked questions about my day, my interests, my choices, without judgment, and I felt a profound gratitude for her understanding. My father, usually reserved, offered gentle compliments and engaged in conversations that felt surprisingly intimate. These moments, small as they seemed, underscored the most important truth: acceptance is not a loud declaration, it is built in quiet gestures, repeated patience, and steady recognition of someone's authenticity. I began documenting my journey in private notes in a journal, reflections on my experiences, moments of fear, joy, and revelation. Writing helped me understand the subtle arcs of my transformation, the intricate ways in which identity shapes not only how others perceive us, but how we perceive ourselves. I realized that courage is not a single, monumental act, but an accumulation of small decisions made repeatedly, choosing authenticity over conformity, acceptance over fear, self-expression over hesitation. And in that understanding, I found a deep sense of purpose. Work, once a place of routine and neutrality, became a stage for subtle experimentation. I allowed my personality to shine in meetings, presentations, and casual interactions. I noticed the way colleagues adapted, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes with quiet acknowledgement. I realized that living authentically has a ripple effect. The courage to claim your identity inspires others, challenges assumptions, and reshapes the spaces we inhabit. And I reveled in the knowledge that my choices, quiet though they were, had meaning beyond myself. Then came a day that crystallized everything I had learned. A distant relative, someone who had known me for years, visited unexpectedly. I had no opportunity to prepare, no chance to present myself in the controlled way I had come to prefer. And yet, when she saw me, she smiled warmly, addressed me as Miss without hesitation, and engaged with me as if the version of myself I had chosen was the only one that had ever existed. My chest swelled with emotion: fear, relief, joy, and pride mingling in a way I had never experienced before. In that instant, I understood something fundamental: authenticity is not performative. It is not about convincing others, correcting assumptions, or defending your choices. It is about living fully, consistently, and courageously. Walking home that evening, the streets quiet and familiar, I reflected on the journey I had undertaken. From that first, accidental moment when a stranger called me Miss, to the weeks of experimentation, fear, and exhilaration, to the quiet victories of acceptance by friends, colleagues, and family, I realized that transformation is both delicate and unstoppable. It begins in the smallest choices, grows through repeated courage, and ultimately reshapes not just the individual but the world around them. I had learned to navigate suspense, to balance fear and exhilaration, to embrace identity fully without apology. And through it all, I discovered a truth that I had long resisted but now accepted wholeheartedly: the person I had always been inside deserved to be seen, recognized, and celebrated. Now, when someone addresses me as Miss, I feel a calm certainty. I no longer flinch, hesitate, or correct. I smile, nod, and allow the world to meet me as I am. Each instance is a quiet affirmation of the journey I have taken, a reminder that courage is cumulative, that transformation is possible, and that authenticity carries its own profound reward. I have discovered that the most extraordinary changes are often subtle, internal, and quiet, yet their impact resonates through every interaction, every relationship, every moment of life. In the stillness of my apartment, in the reflection of a mirror, in the recognition of a stranger, I see the culmination of a journey that began with a single choice: not to correct someone who called me Miss. That choice, small as it seemed at the time, unlocked a freedom I had never known. I walk through the world fully, authentically, and unapologetically, aware of the tension, the suspense, and the delicate power of transformation. And in that awareness, I find not fear, not doubt, but a quiet, enduring joy: the knowledge that I am finally, wholly, and irrevocably myself. The months turned into a full year, and every day brought new realizations about myself and the quiet power of living authentically. I noticed the smallest things that once would have gone unnoticed: how my reflection caught the light differently, the subtle way my hair framed my face, the gentle shift in my posture that had once been awkward but now felt natural. Each detail was a confirmation, a whisper that I was moving closer to the person I had always wanted to be but had been too afraid to acknowledge. And yet, there were moments of doubt, those fleeting, sharp pangs of anxiety when the world seemed too vast, too uncertain, too ready to judge. But the more I resisted correcting others, the more I realized that courage is not the absence of fear, it is acting in spite of it. I began to embrace rituals that had once felt foreign. Choosing an outfit each morning became an act of intention, of celebration. I experimented with colors, textures, and shapes that resonated with me. I discovered the joy of fabrics that moved with me rather than against me, of accessories that expressed something I had always wanted to say but never could. Each time I stepped out, the world responded. People smiled, nodded, adjusted their language. I found the thrill of recognition in the most mundane interactions, from a clerk in a convenience store to a colleague passing in the hallway. Every miss felt like a quiet victory, a ripple of authenticity pushing outward into a world that often feels rigid and inflexible. Social situations, once sources of anxiety, became stages for subtle experimentation. I learned to navigate conversations with poise, to assert myself without confrontation, to embrace attention without fear. Friends who had once been puzzled now adapted, some with curiosity, some with awe, others with quiet admiration. Their reactions were never the primary goal. I realized I was living for myself, but seeing the world respond to my courage gave me a profound sense of affirmation. Even family, who had once been cautious and hesitant, grew more relaxed. My parents asked about my day, my choices, my feelings, without judgment or expectation. I understood that acceptance is built not through declarations, but through small gestures, patience, and consistent demonstration of authenticity. There were still tests of my resolve. One evening, a former acquaintance who had known me for years met me unexpectedly. For a moment, I braced for judgment, for awkward questions, for ridicule. But instead, they smiled, addressed me as Miss, and engaged in conversation as if nothing unusual had occurred. I felt a rush of relief and gratitude, a confirmation that living authentically is not only possible, but capable of reshaping even long-held perceptions. It was a reminder that transformation is not sudden, it is gradual, quiet, and cumulative. Work, too, reflected the subtle power of my transformation. My presentations, emails, and casual interactions carried a new weight, a quiet authority rooted not in pretense but in the certainty of self. Colleagues adapted unconsciously, subtly acknowledging the shift without fanfare. I realized that authenticity radiates outward, influencing not only how others see you but how they interact with you, shaping environments in ways you may never fully measure. The suspense of whether I would be accepted gradually faded, replaced by a calm confidence that comes from living truthfully. Even in quiet moments alone, the transformation revealed its deepest effects. Standing in front of a mirror, I studied my reflection, the softness of my features, the gentle strength in my posture, the alignment of inner self and outward presence. I recognized the courage it took to reach this point, the countless small decisions that led here. I understood that identity is fluid, that courage is persistent, and that the world is often more accepting than we dare to hope if only we are brave enough to be ourselves. And then came a moment that crystallized everything I had learned. I attended a family gathering, a place that had always been filled with rigid expectations and subtle pressures. I dressed fully in the style that felt authentic, intentionally and deliberately. As I entered the room, faces that had known me for years registered surprise, curiosity, and ultimately recognition. Conversations flowed, interactions felt natural, laughter was shared without hesitation. No one corrected my identity, no one questioned my choices. And in that space, surrounded by those I loved, I felt a profound liberation. I realized that courage, authenticity, and patience can transform not only your own life, but the way others perceive and relate to you. Walking home that night, the quiet streets stretching before me, I reflected on the journey. It began with a single choice not to correct someone who called me Miss and had unfolded into a profound transformation, both internal and external. I understood that identity is not fixed, that courage manifests in countless small acts, and that living authentically reshapes your world in subtle yet powerful ways. Fear and doubt still lingered at times, but they no longer controlled me. I had discovered that transformation is not about dramatic gestures or public declarations, it is about small, consistent choices, about inhabiting your truth fully and unapologetically. Now, when the word miss is spoken, I no longer flinch. I smile, I nod, and I carry the quiet certainty that comes from embracing myself fully. Every instance, every interaction, every acknowledgement is a testament to the journey I have undertaken, to the courage I have found, and to the joy of living authentically. Transformation, I have learned, is a gentle, persistent force. It begins quietly, grows steadily, and ultimately reshapes not only the individual, but the world around them. And in that knowledge, I have found a freedom, a peace, and a joy that are irrevocable, enduring, and wholly mine. With time, the quiet transformations became part of the fabric of my daily life. Every morning I dressed with intention, aware of the way the world would perceive me, yet grounded in the certainty of who I had become. I found joy in the simplest things, the way sunlight caught my hair as I walked down the street, the softness of fabrics against my skin, the small smiles of strangers who addressed me with the recognition I had once craved. Each miss became a quiet affirmation, a reminder that I had stepped fully into my truth. The thrill of being seen, truly seen, no longer came with fear or hesitation, it came with a calm, enduring satisfaction that settled deep in my chest. I began to notice subtle shifts in my interactions that I hadn't anticipated. Colleagues treated me with a new kind of attentiveness, one born not of obligation but of genuine acknowledgement. Friends approached conversations with a warmth and curiosity that reflected their recognition of my authenticity. Even casual acquaintances, those who had only known a version of me that was safe and conventional, adjusted without fanfare, accepting the reality of who I had chosen to be. I realized then that authenticity carries a quiet, almost imperceptible influence, one that reshapes environments, alters perceptions, and opens doors in ways you never expect. Family moments grew more meaningful. My parents, once cautious and measured, now engaged with me naturally, asking questions, sharing stories, listening with attention and care. My mother would comment on my choices of clothing or accessories, not with judgment but with genuine interest. My father, usually reserved, began to offer quiet compliments, subtle acknowledgments that spoke volumes. Each gesture reinforced a simple truth: acceptance is cultivated over time through patience, presence, and repeated demonstration of authenticity. It is not given in a single, dramatic moment, it is earned and nurtured in the quiet rhythms of daily life. Yet, even as life settled into this new rhythm, moments of suspense persisted. There were fleeting pangs of anxiety when meeting someone new, a stranger who had no prior reference for who I had become. Would they accept me, acknowledge me, or reject the subtle cues of my identity? In those moments, I relied on the inner calm I had cultivated, the understanding that my authenticity, expressed consistently, was more persuasive than any explanation or argument. I discovered that courage is not about eliminating fear, it is about moving forward despite it. One evening, I encountered a situation that crystallized the journey I had undertaken. I attended a community event, an informal gathering of neighbors, acquaintances, and local friends. I arrived fully in the style that reflected my identity, my posture, gestures, and presence all aligned with the person I had cultivated over the past year. As I mingled, I noticed subtle glances, quiet acknowledgments, nods of recognition. People addressed me as Miss without hesitation. Conversations flowed easily, laughter was shared freely, and I felt, perhaps for the first time, a deep and abiding sense of belonging. In that moment, I understood that transformation is not only about self-perception, it is about harmonizing the inner self with the outer world in a way that invites recognition, respect, and connection. Walking home later, the city quiet around me, I reflected on the journey. From the first accidental miss that set this chain in motion, to the weeks of experimentation, fear, and exhilaration, to the months of subtle, cumulative affirmation, I had come to understand a profound truth: identity is not a fixed label imposed by others. It is a living, evolving force, shaped by courage, intention, and the willingness to inhabit one's truth fully. The world, often perceived as rigid or unyielding, has a remarkable capacity to adjust when met with consistent authenticity and calm confidence. Now, when someone says Miss, it is not merely a title. It is a reflection of every choice I have made, every moment of courage I have embraced, every subtle act of self-acceptance. It represents the quiet, relentless journey of transformation, the journey of stepping into oneself fully, unapologetically, and without fear. And in that acknowledgement, I have found a freedom that is enduring, a peace that is profound, and a joy that is irrevocably mine. The suspense, the uncertainty, the quiet tests of courage, they are all part of the journey, woven into the fabric of an identity that is no longer hidden but fully realized. As I move through the world today, I carry with me a deep awareness of how far I have come. Every interaction, every glance, every moment of recognition is a testament to the choices I have made, the courage I have nurtured, and the authenticity I now inhabit. Transformation, I have learned, is not a dramatic event but a series of deliberate acts, quiet affirmations, and sustained courage. And in living authentically, I have discovered a life richer, fuller, and more deeply satisfying than I ever imagined possible, a life where I am wholly, irrevocably, and unreservedly myself.